Joining me now in our Toronto studio is Dr. Samir Sinha. He's the Director of Geriatrics at Sinha Health System and the University Health Network in Toronto. And also on the line is Professor Stephen Hoffman. He's the Director of the Global Strategy Lab and Professor of Law, Health, and Political Science at York University. Professor Hoffman is in self-quarantine at his home in Toronto now, so he's joining us via Skype. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thanks for having us.
Professor Hoffman, let's start with you. You're in self-isolation right now. Why?
Well, a week ago, I returned from the UK from a work trip there. And as of last Friday, Toronto Public Health, and then as of yesterday, all of Canada, anyone returning from abroad has been asked to be in self-quarantine. It's a measure that's being taken out of abundance of caution, but it's also reflective of the fact that there is a lot of things happening around the world, and this is one way to make sure that we lessen the number of cases that we see in Canada. So everyone should be following it, and I am as well.
Yeah, well, what do you make of the decisions taken by the Canadian government in the past few days, especially the calls that Canadians abroad should return home while they still can?
Well, the government's response is very much both about the virus and the new data and realities that we're seeing, but it's also based on how we're seeing other governments around the world react. For example, there's many governments that are imposing quite strict shutdowns, which can be very difficult for a Canadian traveling abroad, particularly someone who might not have family or friends where they are, to cope. So as a result, the government, I think, is taking the prudent move to ask folks that if they don't need to travel for essential purposes outside of the country, to remain in Canada, where they will have access to a great healthcare system if they need it. And if they are abroad for example, traveling, and they can come home, to make sure to do so before any airlines might stop flying, for example.
Dr. Sinha, in a lot of parts of the country, schools are closing, the sporting events are canceled, the public venues are shut down. Can you explain to us why it's so important to have these social distancing measures being taken at an early stage to try to prevent the number of infections?
Well, I think what we're seeing is, we're trying to be proactive right now when many other countries have been reactive. And that's basically, it's just in line with what this virus actually is. This is a virus that is transmitted through droplets, right? So it's an airborne illness. And it's one of those things that, again, if we're in close proximity with each other and I cough at you and we're within 2 meters of each other, that likely could be a way I could infect you. And this is a highly contagious virus. It's much more contagious than, say, the flu right now. It has a larger case fatality ratio. And we've seen how it's spread kind of undetected very quickly in places like Italy and the US and many parts of Europe now. And so this is our chance to try and get ahead of it and literally flatten the curve.
Well, flatten the curve. So you mentioned that term that's on everybody's talking about now. Can you explain that to us? What does that mean?
Yeah, the idea that if we don't do things, right, if we don't start socially isolating where appropriate, if we don't start taking these measures now, the challenges are that we can start seeing people get infected very quickly, large numbers of people, and then you see exactly what people are thinking about happened in Italy. All of a sudden, it seemed to be a few cases. The next day, now we have over 20,000 cases, and hundreds are dying every single day. And so that's what we mean by flattening the curve, is if we can get ahead of this, then we can slow the growth in the rate of infections and hopefully the growth in the rate of deaths as well.
And we're going to have an Italian doctor on to tell us what he's seeing right now. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that after we to speak with him. Professor Hoffman, again, about that term flattening the curve. Have we imposed enough measures early enough to have that effect here?
Ultimately, we won't know until after the fact whether we're doing it exactly right. But the key is that at this point, we do need to take some measures. But when we do those measures, we have to have equal focus on making sure we don't underreact, but as well that we don't overreact. Because, of course, every time we take a measure, it actually has a lot of downstream consequences that can affect a whole lot of people, and also can even sometimes undermine the public health response. So, for example, I think it's great that our government has been giving guidance about trying to avoid non-essential travel outside of the country, but it would be a totally different thing if our government instead decided to actually ban all travel, including incoming travel, which would include essential travel being affected. That would be something like what we've seen in some respects in the United States. That would be something that would be an overreaction, one that actually would affect the public health response and would also be illegal under international law, something to avoid. So I think right now, are we doing enough? From what we can tell, our governments are doing quite a lot. And each jurisdiction across the country is likely to do slightly different things depending on the local context within a province and within each community. But so far, it seems like Canada is well prepared and taking robust action.